Secretary Geithner, thank you for doing this, first and foremost.
Good to be here.
A document you released today says normalization of financial markets achieved to date is, quote, partial and fragile, and that improvements may not last without a period of government support. How much more is needed?
What you're seeing already is enough signs of a stability, confidence improving, so that there's been dramatically lower support for the financial system. Banks are repaying capital. The emergency measures we put in place at the peak of the panic were effective enough that they are no longer as important. But this is going to take a while. You know, we started with an enormously damaged financial system, and if we're going to have an economy that's growing again, people getting back to work, you need to make sure they have access to credit.
Partial and fragile doesn't, those words don't instill a lot of confidence.
But it really is dramatically better today, Katie, than it was. Think about a year ago. People, for the first time in a century in this country, were wondering about whether they should keep their money in banks. It was a tragic, terrible thing. But today, again, you have a lot of private capital came into the financial system. The system is stronger because of that. Borrowing costs have coming down for corporations and for families. Those are the initial signs of improvement, and that's why the economy is starting to grow again.
Having said that, it's been a year since Lehman collapsed, and yet Congress has passed only one major piece of financial regulation having to do with credit cards. Derivatives, still largely unregulated. Huge bonuses are back. And after saying you want to prevent another too big to fail scenario, Mr. Secretary, just 4 banks offer half of all mortgages and 2/3 of all credit cards in this country. So what has really changed?
Well, Katie, we're going to change this financial system fundamentally. We have to, because we can't afford to let this country be in a position again where you could suffer this much damage. And that's going to require comprehensive reform, but it requires legislation. And we are moving incredibly quickly to give Congress the suite of proposals necessary to legislate. Again, remember, it is only this quarter the economy is starting to grow again. We're at the very early stage of repair and recovery, and yet the President of the United States decided to move very quickly before the memory of the crisis faded. We want to move very, very quickly, but it requires legislation.
But it's been a year, and some people are saying,
well, we've been in office.
Geithner, why?
We've been in office for
but
about
since the collapse,
8 months.
I'll give
and
you that.
Again, we inherited the worst financial crisis in a generation, enormous problems across the economy as a whole. We're moving exceptionally quickly, but we can't put in place stronger rules without Congress legislating.
Having said that, some experts warn that if the industry's systemic risks are not addressed, they could cause an even bigger crisis in years and not in decades.
Yeah, we're not going to let that happen. We can't let that happen.
I know you've only been in office 8 months, but at the same time, why hasn't more been done on the regulatory front? I read my New York Times on Saturday, and I thought this kind of headline must give you indigestion. It says, a year after a cataclysm, little change on Wall Street. Progress is slow on regulatory overhaul, posing risk of even bigger crisis.
Again, actually, I think Congress is going to move this year. I think they're going to move earlier than any country in response to past crises has thought about reform. But reform is critical. The market cannot solve these problems. We saw already, just going back, the failure of market discipline to work. You can't expect the market to solve this problem on its own. It requires rules governments set and enforce, not just here in the United States, but around the world. And again, this president is moving exceptionally quickly. Many people, as you know, Katie, have accused the president of doing too much too soon, trying to accomplish too much too quickly. But because reform is so important, he chose to move at the earliest stage of his administration.
Robert Shiller, who's a professor of economics at Yale, who predicted the collapse of the dot-com bubble, says that he believes the window of opportunity may be closing, momentum has been lost, and complacency may be setting in yet again. Are you worried you didn't act quickly enough?
No, I'm not. Again, I'm very confident. I think America should be confident that we will get financial reform. We want it to be a strong package of reforms, though. Again, not just here, but around the world. And that's why the president proposed to Congress sweeping reforms so quickly, even in the midst of this acute fire we were facing.
So are you saying?
But it takes Congress to act. And if you listen to the leadership of the Congress today, if you listen to Chairman Frank, Chairman Dodd, they're very committed to move. And I think they believe that they're starting to see the consensus around reform.
Why hasn't Congress done more faster?
Well, again, they're doing a lot of things, and I think they actually are moving quite quickly. And the risk we face now, Katie, is not that you see a premature response to too much risk-taking. The risk we face now still is that people aren't taking enough risk. The risk we face after years of excess, taking on too much risk and leverage, The risk for the American people now is that people are sort of too tentative still. So we do have a time, not a long period of time, but we do have a time now to work over the next few weeks and months to get this right, get it in place.
But aren't banks taking a lot of risks? I mean, there's a big difference between banks taking risks and individual consumers taking risks,
again,
right?
Banks too, as a whole, and this is what happens after you go through these kind of bubbles, is that people overcorrect. And they go through a period of taking too little risk, they pull back too much, and that's what makes the risk of recession deeper. So you need to make sure that companies who are viable, families that are viable, have access to credit. And so that's why we've worked so hard to get this financial system more stable, get it back on track. But obviously we need to move on to reform. But I'm quite confident we're going to see a strong package legislated by this Congress.
Let me ask you about bonuses, because some firms cutting back on them are actually raising salaries. As you know, 5 of the biggest banks set aside $60 billion to cover compensation. That's just $17 billion less than 2007. And with layoffs, that's a lot fewer people getting that money. So doesn't this amount to business as usual in many ways?
We can't let business as usual. We can't let things go back to where they were. You know, what happened in compensation was really terrible. It wasn't just the size of the packages, and they were, I think, offensive to many people just looking at the spectacle of what happened here in New York. But it was the way they were done. People were paid for taking too much risk. They were paid even if they didn't perform. And they brought this financial system to the edge of collapse. And that's why, as part of fixing the system, we have to change those compensation practices.
But isn't this a shell game? They're just putting more money for salaries and less for bonuses, and people are still getting mega
if that's what happens,
payments?
If that's what happens, then we would have failed. Again, because what you want is a system where the vast majority of compensation for a senior person in a firm is at risk, is not guaranteed, is tied to the performance of his firm, vests over a long period of time. Again, and so that the interests of the executive are aligned with the interests of the firm and the financial system as a whole. That's the kind of change we need to have. And if what happens is people just raise the fixed guaranteed portion of compensation, that would be a terrible mistake. We can't let that happen. And we're not going to leave this to the market to do. Again, we propose Congress legislate reforms, require disclosure, require shareholders have to approve compensation practices, and we're going to make sure that the supervisors of the country enforce strong standards to force reform.
Are you troubled by the fact that there's still a lot of risk-taking on Wall Street?
Again, Katie, I don't think that's our main risk now for the moment. But what we can't do is allow our system ever again to go back to the point where people can take on a level of risk and leverage that would imperil the stability of the country, the fortunes of average Americans. And what's tragic in financial crises, and what's tragic about what happens in the country, is people who were careful, who were responsible, didn't borrow too much, live within their means, are suffering because of choices made by people who weren't so careful. That's the tragedy in this.
But at the top 5 banks, the size of potential trading losses are $1 billion a day this year compared to $500 million in 2007. That's not troubling to you?
Again, we're not going to let this financial system get back to the point where it's taking on too much risk. Again, right now, the risk we face, I think, still is that banks are being a little cautious as a whole. You're seeing bank lending decline, not rise. Because of the effects of the things we put in place, the system is more stable, and the cost of borrowing has come down very substantially. So businesses are much more likely to be able to borrow today than they were 3, 6, 9 months ago. But still, we need to make sure that we have a system, a financial system. Credit, it's like oxygen for economies. Without oxygen, they can't grow. And we're only at the beginning now where we're beginning to grow again.
A lot of effort and political capital, as you know, is being spent on healthcare reform. And you have said comprehensive financial regulatory reform is critical for avoiding another crisis. And yet, the reform remains elusive. Do you think the administration has its priorities mixed up?
I don't think so. And again, I think that if you listen to the President, leadership of Congress, there's a lot of support for moving on financial reform. And I think you're going to see it happen. But just listen to the chairman of the committees that have to build a consensus and legislate. They're actually pretty confident they're going to get this through, and because I think they recognize how important it is.
Many view toxic assets, those bundles of bad loans held by many banks, as a cancer inside the financial system. Treasury's been working on a way to get those assets off the bank's books. Since last year, how big a threat are they, and what is taking so long for that to happen?
Actually, the banks as a whole are in, again, a much stronger position today than they were 9 months ago. Because of the programs we put in place that forced banks to go through a very difficult stress test and to disclose the results of that test to the world, they've been able to raise private capital, have much more capital today, and some of the stronger banks have been able to repay capital to the government. What that means is that these legacy assets, these real estate loans, these bad loans that many banks made, are much less damaging to the system, much less of a source of risk. And so, again, the best test of what we've done is the cost of borrowing coming down to a level that's more reasonable given the state of the economy as a whole, and the cost of borrowing has come down dramatically.
Someone is going to have to pay down the mountain of debt created by this financial crisis. Do you believe, Mr. Secretary, an across-the-board tax increase is inevitable?
One thing that we all believe is that as a country, we're going to have to go back to the point where we're living within our means again. This crisis came in part because we borrowed too much. We allowed too much leverage to build up in part of the financial system. And many families across the country did borrow beyond their means. And I think people recognize that these deficits are unsustainable, and if we're going to have a stronger economy in the future, we have to bring them down. But our first challenge, Katie, is to get the economy back to the point where it is growing again, people can get back to work.
Is an across-the-board tax increase inevitable?
I don't think so, no. The president committed in the campaign not to raise taxes on people earning less than $250,000 a year. He's committed to that. You saw early in his administration support a recovery plan to cut taxes for 95% of working Americans. Those basic values are going to shape the policies he proposes to the country. It's going to be difficult for us to get through, but we can do this. This is a problem we can solve.
As you know, a lot of people say taxing the wealthiest Americans is just not going to cut it. You're going to need to do more. You're going to have to increase taxes for the middle class and small businesses.
Katie, I said what the president's committed to, and he made that commitment in the campaign, and it's going to shape, those values will shape his approach to governing.
So you can say right now, Mr. Geithner,
I can say that he committed in the campaign not to raise taxes on people earning less than $250,000 a year, and that as you saw the Recovery Act he helped shape, we cut taxes on 95% of working Americans, and as we get ourselves back to the point where we're growing and we reduce our long-term deficits, we're going to do so in ways that don't add to the burden on middle-class Americans.
So you can pledge to me right now there will be no tax increase on middle-class Americans or small businesses.
I can repeat to you his commitment to the American people.
But things have changed since he made that commitment. Do you
right,
still believe that?
But Katie, let's just step back for a second. We started this administration with enormously high deficits that were a consequence of a long period of borrowing to finance the commitments, new commitments by the government, expensive commitments of the government. And we started with a huge deficit caused by the worst recession in generations. Now, to fix that problem, we've had to do some temporary but necessary things. And we're committed to winding those back, winding them down, reversing them as quickly as possible. And you're already seeing the signs of us delivering on that by having banks repay capital, have the government support for the financial sector start to wind down. And that's a sign of progress. And you should see that as a sign of commitment by this president, this administration, to get out of this as quickly as it's prudent to do so.
Today's Treasury Department plan for the next phase of financial stabilization says TARP, quote, provides a critical backstop for financial stability. It will expire at the end of the year unless you ask for an extension. Do you think you will?
I don't need to ask for an extension. I need to inform Congress that it's appropriate to do so and explain why. But Katie, one important lesson of financial crises is that governments tend to not just act too late. They tend to underestimate how severe it was, as many countries did in this crisis, but they tend to put on the brakes too early, and in doing so raise the long-term costs of fixing these problems, and we're not going to make that mistake. So what I can say is we're already bringing down the emergency assistance to lower levels, and we're going to keep providing support necessary to help make sure that we're helping this housing crisis get back, this housing market get back on track, that businesses can borrow again, that consumer credit markets are working better. And that's going to take, whatever that takes, we're going to do that.
Will you extend TARP funds?
Haven't made that judgment yet, but if we think additional support is necessary, then we're going to go do that because we think long term that will be cheaper for the country.
3 more banks failed last week, bringing the number to 92. According to the FDIC, 400 banks are at high risk of failing. Most of them are smaller community banks that help small business and create jobs. How alarmed are you by that number?
FDIC is doing a very good job of helping managing through that problem, and you're right to underscore the fact that there's still challenges ahead for this financial system. It took us a long time to get into this mess. It's going to take us a while to get through it. But I think we're in a much better position today because the Recovery Act is getting traction. We have growth starting again. There's more confidence in the financial system. Borrowing costs are down. We're in a much stronger position today to get through this.
So is the recession that began in December of 2007, in your view, over?
Katie, I'm not an economist, and economists don't know that much about the future, much less the very recent past. But most economists today think the economy is growing now for the first time.
So would you say, in your estimation, the recession is over?
Again, they're likely to conclude, but that's a job for the economists. They're likely to conclude that it ended already. But our test, the test of our responsibility is to get the economy growing so it no longer requires support from the government, so we get people back to work. Businesses are growing again, not shrinking.
The White House said last week the government has only spent a fifth of the stimulus money. Why so little?
That's not quite right.
$151 billion?
Let me just step back for this very important question. Stimulus had a bunch of tax cuts for individuals and businesses. Those were announced, took effect right away, even though their impact is spread over a 2-year period of time.
Right.
Also had very substantial immediate support for state and local governments, so that states didn't have to fire thousands of teachers, firemen, policemen. Those actions took immediate effect. The stimulus also had a bunch of programs to improve infrastructure of this country. And that took a little bit longer to get going, but actually we're ahead of schedule on that front. And that's going to be very helpful for us, because that means that over the next 3, 6, 9 months, you're going to see significant additional support start to come on stream. The stimulus program was designed to provide support for 2 years, because this was such a challenging recession. And you're seeing it, as I said, starting to get traction. I was in Cleveland a few weeks ago, and even in that part of the country, facing just enormous challenges, you could see small businesses start to say, now we can start to see the impact of these programs now.
A lot of Americans may think the stimulus package isn't really working, that not enough has been spent, right, and not enough jobs have been created, even though many jobs have been saved. Right. What would you say to those people?
I would say that they're right that we're only now starting to see growth. Unemployment rate is still at unacceptably high. We're still losing jobs net as an economy, although at dramatically lower pace than we were at the beginning of the year. But things are we're making progress though, and growth is just the beginning. But it underscores the fact that we're committed to stick through this until we get the economy back on track, people are back to work again. But just at the beginning, but we're here today with a more stable financial system, an economy that's growing, because of the impact of the measures the President proposed, Congress enacted.
Isn't creating jobs really important? Obviously, saving jobs
everything we're doing.
But you all don't really differentiate between saving and creating jobs. You say the stimulus package has saved or created 1 million jobs this year. Isn't creating jobs so imperative?
Of course.
And what have you done on that front?
Of course, the ultimate test is that we have an economy, again, that is creating jobs on net. And we're now approaching the point where that seems relatively near. Again, economists, I think their basic judgment now is that the economy is going to start creating jobs on net sometime over the next 3 to 6 months. And that means the unemployment rate will start to come down. But you're absolutely right. That is the critical test of everything we're doing. That's what we will be judged by. And that's why this government moves so quickly to try to do so much.
I know you say move so quickly, but yet what's taken so long to create these jobs, I think, is the question.
Well, Katie, this is a big hole we inherited. It took a long time to get to this point. I think everybody understood that it was going to take some time to get out of it. I actually think that we are ahead of what was a realistic expectation when we took office. The President's economic team, met with him in Chicago in December to talk about the challenges the country faced and what it was going to take. And I don't think there was anybody in that room at that point that could have told the President that we would be this far along, this far back from the abyss, only 9 months into his administration.
As you know, economic growth is powered by consumer spending. And a recent Gallup poll found that 70% of Americans are cutting expenses. Household borrowing is dropping sharply at a clip of more than 10%. So what out there, Secretary Geithner, might light a fire under the economy and create sustainable growth?
It's going to come gradually, but the first step is to pull the economy back from the abyss, to put out the fire that was so damaging to confidence and activity. And you're starting to see the signs of that happening. Part of what we're going through is just a transition to going back to a point where we're living within our means. So people are saving more. That is a fundamentally healthy thing. We're not going to have a growing economy in the future unless people save more of income. And a lot of that's already happened. We're borrowing dramatically less from the rest of the world. When we started, we were borrowing between 6 and 7% of GDP a year from the rest of the world. Now that's fallen to about 3. Again, people are saving more. Those are helpful signs of transition.
Is the final lesson of the financial crisis in the modern era, is that only the government and not players in the free market can keep a financial panic from pushing the entire global system into oblivion? And if so, what are the implications of that assessment for capitalism?
Market discipline in financial systems does not constrain risk-taking leverage enough. That's why governments have to regulate financial activity, do a much better job of putting in place rules of the game. If we learn anything, we've learned that. Shouldn't have had to learn it with this much trauma, but this is not, financial systems by definition can't self-regulate. And markets can't solve financial crises. You had a lot of people in the midst of this crisis, as it gained momentum, saying we should let this thing burn itself out, it'll take care of itself. And look what happened to the country. Look what happened to this economy. Look at the global economy in the last quarter of last year. To solve a crisis, this is a lesson we learned in the 30s, Japan learned in the 90s, countries around the world have learned. Governments have to act with enormous force and speed. When they don't do it, it causes a lot of damage. It's more expensive to solve longer term.
Having said that, do you think the Treasury's involvement in the free market and some of the solutions that you put forward in terms of bailing out the auto industry or with TARP funds, in a way, has that fed the anti-government fervor we now see permeating many corners of society when it comes to healthcare reform?
I think you see enormous anger, frustration, and anxiety about what's happened to the country, and concern about where we're in and what that means for the future. But again, the basic lesson of financial crises, and it's a difficult lesson, is that if governments don't act in the midst of the storm, you see enormous damage. Again, look what happened to the country in the last quarter of last year. After the failure of Lehman Brothers. Look what happened. Look how damaging that was. You had thousands of companies fail who shouldn't fail. You had millions of Americans lose their jobs who did not need to lose their jobs. It requires governments acting. And we have less capital in the financial system today than when I took office. We've had banks repay $80 billion of capital. We're showing a concrete lesson of the experience. If you do enough, then you'll solve it more quickly. It'll be cheaper. We'll be able to get out of the financial system as quickly as possible.
And do you really feel that you have done everything in your power as Treasury Secretary to put systems in place as quickly as possible to prevent a financial crisis of this magnitude from ever happening again?
Absolutely not yet. But as I said, that requires Congress legislating reforms. You can't do that without legislation, and it has to happen here and around the world. But what we did is, in the early months of this administration, we proposed, again, the most sweeping reforms this country has contemplated in decades.
And how confident are you that Congress will enact those?
And I'm very confident they're going to enact it because, again, I think people understand that this was just terribly damaging, and it's not going to fix it on itself. It's going to require stronger rules of the game, requires legislation.
And you're not worried the window's closed?
Again, that's why we need to move quickly. That's why we move so early, because you don't want people to forget how bad it was. And change in these areas is hard, because it affects a lot of interests, and you're seeing a lot of people resist change. But that's why it's important to do. And if you ask people whether they believe in the need for stronger reform, it's something that has very broad support, I think, on Capitol Hill, around the country, around the world, and it should.
All right. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner, thank you so much.
Nice to see you.